If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Dr. Ryan Scoats from Coventry University. And Ryan's research is a really interesting, fascinating area. He's just completed a book called Understanding Threesomes, Gender, Sex and Consensual Non-monogamy. And Ryan has conducted more than several, lots and lots of interviews with people who have experienced threesomes to try and understand their experiences. So certainly one that I think you'll be interested in. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I am Dr. Ryan Scoats and I am a lecturer in sociology at Coventry University.
Thank you, Ryan. And where did sociology start for you?
It's been a bit of a long road for me. I've come from maybe a less traditional kind of background. So I initially studied sociology at A-level. But then I went into a sort of more of a sports side of thing and did my initial bachelor's in coaching, education and sports development. And I found myself being continually drawn back to the sociological side of things. So there were a lot of social science, so sociology, psychology-based modules within that. And those were what really interested me. So I ended up doing my dissertation on masculinity within sports. And then after a bit of time out, I went back and did a master's in sociology and research. And then finally my PhD in sociology. So yeah, I initially kind of started in the area of sports sociology and have branched out into gender and sexuality and sexual behavior. So there's quite a few areas that I have interest in and that I conduct research in and teach in. And yeah.
Excellent. So masculinity, sport, I'm interested in kind of theorists and writers. Who interested you? Who was sort of inspiring you?
So with the masculinities things, I would say Eric Anderson. He was one of my course lecturers and ended up being my supervisor for my undergraduate and actually my PhD in the end. And so his ideas about masculinity and how it was changing and sort of building off of Raewyn Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity, but showing how it's developed and potentially doesn't always hold true in all areas. So this was a really fundamental person and some fundamental ideas that helped shape my knowledge. And then moving on from that, I would say some of the more classical theorists like Goffman and particularly his work on stigma and the sort of tainted identity, as well as Rubin and the charm circle and how some behaviors are legitimate and some are less legitimate. They are more stigmatized. But then equally, we can see how that changes in different areas. So this is not a global or even a sort of thing limited to one country. This can change. This can be very different from one group of people to another. And I think these are really useful and interesting ideas to help us understand the world and have definitely influenced my own ideas and my research.
That's interesting. Do you know, in all of these that I do, I always ask people who inspired them. Probably number one that ever comes up is Pierre Bourdieu.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Number two is Goffman, actually, who you just mentioned, particularly presentation and self. And I also think every single person I've spoke to who's interested in something to do with gender identity and masculinity mentions Connell.
Yes. Yeah. Well, these are really foundational people. So Connell, she was writing about masculinities at a time when it was quite psychological that it was spoken about. And I think she really put things into an understandable way. And power is always a running thread that makes a lot of sense. We can see power all around us. And so Connell really shaped masculinities to be understood through that lens of power and hierarchy. And similarly, it was understandable. And I think this is perhaps why Goffman is quite popular. It's not too academic in its language. You can read it and you can understand it, and it doesn't exclude people, which I think some of the older theorists, they can get a bit confusing, a bit overly analytical, and there's nothing quite like trying to sort of slog your way through one of these articles and then at the end think, okay, what did any of that mean? Whereas I think you don't quite get that with the likes of Connell and Goffman and others, of course.
Yeah, it's that accessibility, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's something that I try and emulate and strive for in my own work. Personally, I believe that if we are going to be writing about these things and talking about these things, they should be for everyone. It doesn't matter if you are doing a PhD or whether you've even been to university. These ideas can be useful. So why shouldn't they be accessible to everyone?
Agreed. So let's move on to your own work then, Ryan. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what your research focuses on?
Sure. So at the moment, my big research area and focus is on consensual non-monogamy and specifically threesomes. And my initial research into this area was looking at how and why do people have threesomes. So we're talking about three people having sex together at the same time. And when I started looking at this, I was quite surprised that there was relatively little research out there on it. So threesomes were quite often a footnote in things, but this seems strange to me because what little research there was suggested that there were interesting things about them. They deserve to be studied within their own right. That kind of led me down the path of trying to understand these and understand them in a contemporary setting.
And I have to ask, Ryan, where was the inspiration? Because it is quite a niche area and quite an understudied area. What piqued your interest in wanting to study something like this?
So this is a question I get a lot, and I'm not embarrassed to say it came from personal experience. So I think, like a lot of things, people have an experience of something, and if you are academically minded or in that kind of area, then you perhaps turn to the literature to try and understand your own experiences. And that's exactly what it was. So I had a threesome and it didn't turn out quite how I expected. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. The media says it's going to be like this, but it wasn't. And so that's when I went and sort of tried to understand it through the use of academic works, which I trusted a bit more than the sort of front page of the tabloids. And I found that whilst there was some work which touched upon these areas, it really wasn't talking to my own experience. It wasn't explaining to me. And this got me thinking, maybe there's a lot of other people out there who have similar experiences that are different to what has been thus far recorded. And these people are kind of being missed out. I think there has been, certainly in the past, an assumption that people who engage in threesomes or BDSM or whatever it may be, they are particularly different and they are really on the fringes of society, perhaps in many things that they do. And I think whilst there will be those people, there's also going to be a whole swathe of people who engage in these things. And for want of a better way of describing it, in all other respects, they are normal. It could be the person sat next to you on the bus who you wouldn't think twice about, but maybe they have or do engage in these things. And that is part of what I wanted to try and look at and try and capture.
And for clarification, it's mixed sex threesomes that you study, is that right?
Yeah. So that has been the majority of my work thus far. I have started to look at same-sex threesomes, and I'm at the moment, I've submitted a paper looking at men's same-sex threesomes and, the whys and hows do these come about. And there are some crossovers and similarities, but also some differences within that.
And let's start by how you actually conduct your research. So qualitative research interviews is your main research method,
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So mainly qualitative. I enjoy that rich storytelling approach, being able to get the detail, to understand and to be able to ask the follow-up questions and really dig down into what has this person experienced and how did they experience it and what does that mean to them. But that's not to say that I don't think that other research methods are useful, and I've done some survey style work, again qualitative. I just cannot hold in my head those skills to do the quantitative work unless you're doing it all the time. It seems to just fall out of my head. But this again, it's a way to capture a large amount of qualitative data, but you have a downside of you can't ask those follow-up questions. So interesting things arise, but you can't necessarily follow them up. But that's when you start doing more research.
And so how would you classically conduct one of your interviews? Do you do it face-to-face? Is it anonymous, structured, unstructured?
So I would preferably do it face-to-face, and it would be a semi-structured interview. And with topics such as sexual behavior, and particularly anything which might be perceived as stigmatized, I think it's quite important to establish a good level of rapport with the people that you're speaking to. So they need to be comfortable with you and comfortable that you are not going to be judging them about what they're telling you. So typically I would start off with lighter topics, their experiences of relationships, their perhaps thoughts about sex and casual sex in general, and try and make it quite conversational. I feel that a good interview should almost feel like a conversation. You forget that you're being interviewed, and take it from there, really. Start to build into these more difficult topics. And if there's a bit of a pause, if a person starts to freeze up a bit, just reassure them, remind them that they do not have to answer anything if they don't want to. They can pause, they can take a break. We can talk about something else for a while. And make them feel comfortable and see what they are willing to share with you. Another technique that you can use, that some researchers use, is to share your own experiences of things. So it's this turn taking in conversation. So someone shares something, you share something. Now, that's not to say if they talk about a particular experience, you have to say about your own experiences of that, but you can mirror them in a sense and make them feel more comfortable, make it feel a bit less one-sided, and they're not the only ones who have been in this situation or seen these things or thought about these things.
And so within your sample, what sort of range of people did you try and use? Mixture of males and females, older and younger? What was your kind of sample size?
So I've done a number of studies on this. One of them was 30 university-aged men, approximately second year, so an average of about 20 years old. Another sample was sort of whoever I could get, because I wanted to avoid going to particular sources and give the qualitative sample even more bias. And so it was whoever I could get, and it did turn out to be a fairly homogeneous sample, very white, generally educated, and the age was actually quite a range. But at the same time, I was looking for people who had ever had an experience of threesomes. So I did speak with some older people, sort of 50 plus, and they recounted threesomes from much younger. So the age aspects didn't come into it in the same way. Talking about their experiences, how they maybe reflected on their experiences were perhaps different. But it was, in some respects, quite a homogeneous sample. And then in the final study that I conducted, this was open to everyone. And again, it turned out to be fairly UK-based, fairly white, and generally college or university educated.
Yeah, so kind of opportunity sample.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you mentioned the sort of age. I just wondered is it common that this is kind of a one-off, an experiment that people just try once in their university years, for example, rather than people who continually have threesomes?
It absolutely can be. And I think there is a certain social pressure. I certainly got this from some of my participants, that they wanted to have as many different and varied sexual experiences that they could, this kind of sexual experience gathering. And they felt that they had to do this before they settled into what they might term proper relationship. Otherwise, they would miss that opportunity. They were aware that their opportunities were dwindling, and this would happen with age. And so, especially amongst the young men, there was this urge to go out and do these things and to have these experiences and then settle down into married monogamous life. That wasn't everyone, though. So some people, they did have these experiences, and it did open them up to future experiences, be that more threesomes or sort of thinking about opening their relationship perhaps, or it could also just make them more open in general to thinking about these things. And whereas in the past they might immediately say no to something, in the future they might give it a little more thought because they'd had this new experience and it wasn't as bad as they expected or thought that it might be. So it made them more open to thinking about these things. So I think there definitely is that one-time experience thing, but for some people it can grow and it can become something more. This is completely putting aside those people who are in consensually non-monogamous relationships and have threesomes as a norm. It is how they have sex in their relationship setup.
I'm interested in one of the points you just made there, this kind of glamorization of the threesome to young men. You know, we see that a lot in media, don't we? The idea of a fantasy of a man with two women. And it brought me to the comedian, Richard Herring. He'd always felt this pressure that he should have a threesome at some point. And in his book, Turning 40, he finally gets around to having a threesome just before he turns 40 and finds it a massive disappointment because this social pressure that had been built up that it would be the most wonderful, amazing sexual experience of his life, and it was far from it. Where do you think that pressure on young men to have this kind of threesome has come from?
I think it can come from all sorts of places. I think it can come from their peers and from society and just how we talk about sex. I think another reason why I felt my research was important to do was to demystify this sexual act, because like you're saying with the example of Richard Herring, he had it and it was disappointing. This is what some of the men said. They said, oh yeah, I thought it would be the best thing ever. And then when I had it, it was like, oh, yeah, it was fine. It was almost you could compare it to when people first have sex. Before they have had sex, then they think it's going to be the best thing in the world. And then when they have it, chances are they might feel quite differently. It's unlikely to live up to those expectations. So I think it's coming from a lot of different places, but there are no strong sources that people can draw upon for, well, what is it actually like? Pornography is another one. If people have no knowledge of a sexual act, if it's not talked about, where do they learn about these things? They go to pornography because there are very few other avenues for them to try and understand these things. And pornographic representations of sex are very often not realistic. And so they are perhaps building up this idea of it will be like it is in porn because they have no other reference points. Similarly for women, I think they have the same issue, but whereas the men are seeing it as this is going to be great and perhaps bolster their masculinity in the eyes of others, women are seeing it and thinking, oh, this looks a little bit rough. I don't want to be objectified in that manner. And so if they are to have a threesome with two men, say, they might be more anxious, they might be less interested in doing that, they might fear for their safety. But sometimes when they have these experiences, or not even just with two men, any sort of threesome experience, they come out of it thinking, oh, that actually wasn't as bad as I had imagined it. So our cultural understanding of what a threesome should be like makes men feel and expect that they should be great, and women be a bit more reserved about it. And neither of these quite match up with the experiences that people are having typically.
Yeah, I did wonder if that was part of it, the idea of a man being able to boast about a threesome with two women. Is it just about hegemonic masculinity? You said bolster masculinity. Is it bravado?
I think there will be that in there. I think that can definitely be something, and I did see evidence of that. But by the same token, I did see and speak to a lot of men who would have these experiences with their close male friends, their bromances. And it wasn't so much about boasting to other men. It was more about having that interesting experience and having someone to share that with. And it wasn't necessarily at the expense of the woman who was there. So sometimes the women, if they were friends with the guys, they would be brought in on this, and it would be this experience that they could all reminisce about and share together and think, oh, how crazy we were when we were young. But then it's interesting because, yeah, these ideas about masculinity, and so men can sort of boast about it to their friends. For some men, that will absolutely be the way. And for other men, it's changing. I think there's more sensitive masculinities, more inclusive masculinities emerging. And so this dilutes and changes and diversifies the meanings of masculinity. You almost have these older, more orthodox, traditional understandings of it, and then something new. And you'll have in between that as well. So understandings of what masculinity is really varying these days, I think.
Yeah, much more diversified. And what about for the females who did have a threesome? Did you find the experiences for females was quite different in terms of how they approached it and their experiences from it as well?
Yes, I think they were more cautious. They were more aware of potential dangers, and they also sort of wanted to feel comfortable. So they wanted to feel comfortable with the people that were there, perhaps do it with friends. They feared for their relationships. They also seemed to be more likely to have them whilst in relationships, whereas men tended to want to do it whilst they were single. Women were more likely to have it in a relationship, and so they consequently had fears about what it would do to their relationship, bringing, if it's a heterosexual pairing, another woman into it. And so they would perhaps negotiate various rules and behaviors that they would not engage in order to make the relationship unit appear special and appear different. There was also the thing that I made reference to earlier. So they thought that it was perhaps not as bad as they had expected, or there were less negatives or downsides. There were also the aspects of women, in particular bisexual women, not enjoying these this sort of culture around threesomes, and the expectation that as a bisexual woman they could be brought in to fulfill couples' fantasies. And this is quite a common trope, and these women are referred to as unicorns often because it is quite a rare thing, but something that everyone is like looking for and seeking out, this heterosexual couple looking for a bisexual woman to spice up their relationship. You didn't really have the same for men, though. The premium on bisexual men was not really there. And so this was something much more experienced by this particular group of women. But yeah, it's difficult to say in terms of whether men typically experienced it like this or women typically experienced it like that, because there was so much diversity in how people did experience it. If we think about sex and all the different ways and reasons that sex happens, threesomes were no less, potentially more diverse and complex and complicated than that. So talking about people only having one or even two reasons is not quite the whole picture.
Yeah, I can understand that. It would be very difficult just to pigeonhole what a threesome experience was like.
Yeah. If you have two people, it's complicated enough. I think in Meston and Buss's study on why do people have sex, they asked people to write down the various reasons. And obviously this is a limited sample, but they came up with 237 independent reasons. And this is just from the people that we talked to. There's going to be more on top of that. If we add another person into the mix, then we have a whole host of other reasons as well. So think about ideas of power and fantasy and spicing up relationships. And yeah, it gets incredibly complicated, but this is why it's so interesting.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ryan, because that's going to be the end of part one. I think what will be interesting in part two is if we can hear about some of those case study examples. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Ryan Scoats about a very interesting topic, about his research, understanding threesomes, gender, sex, and consensual non-monogamy. Ryan, do you mind telling us about some of the people that you interviewed? Obviously, you don't need to tell us the names, but some of the experiences that people actually incurred.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a very interesting case of a woman who had a threesome with her husband. And this was a bisexual woman, and she was in a relationship which was somewhat abusive. So there was a lot of power held over her. And she said that she was always trying to do things in order to sort of please her husband and make him stay. And she had a friend visiting once, and they were both in the bathroom, one of them in the bath, and the husband came home. And so this woman invited her friend into the bath and then shouted for the husband to come up. And in the moment, she felt that, oh yeah, let's have a threesome. This will make my husband happy. But what transpired is the husband was much more interested in her friend, and so didn't really give the wife any attention. And the wife immediately recognized this and felt terrible about it, but equally didn't feel that she had the power or the agency to stop the situation. And so this thing that she initially thought would be good for her and the relationship turned bad quite quickly, and created quite a lot of psychological turmoil for her, and these negative feelings around the experience. So this is quite a good example of how we need to recognize that people do not enter into these things in a vacuum. There are all these other pre-standing social relationships and social dynamics already going on. And here we might argue, well, if she wasn't having a nice time, she could have just said, I want to stop this. But we have the pre-existing power dynamic of him having a lot more power over her and her fearing the damage that would happen to the relationship. And so she felt paralyzed to do anything. She could not do anything.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, actually, because maybe this is just my perception from the outside, but often in couples in a relationship who go in to have a threesome, is it pushed by one partner more than the other? I just fear, is there someone that goes along with it just to keep their partner happy? Is it being pushed by one partner more than the other?
It can be, and I think that varies. Yeah, sometimes it definitely is driven, and one person is almost sort of led into it. But other times it's more equitable, and both people are thinking about it and sort of thinking about how they will go about it and how they will find someone. There will probably also be different reasons why the people are interested in doing it. And that's not to say that having different reasons is necessarily bad, but it does highlight why it's important to consider your reasons and to explore those. So if we take an example of, so what I term sexual altruism. So this is the idea of having sex or doing something for someone else, doing something for your partner because it would make them happy. Now, that's not to say that it necessarily makes you unhappy, but it maybe doesn't tick all of your boxes. So in swinging, you have the notion of taking one for the team. So if you have two couples and they meet, maybe two of the people are really interested in each other, and then only one of the other people is interested in the other person. Unless they are all going to swap, then it's not going to happen. But maybe the person who is not interested takes one for the team and engages in it in order to make the group work. So people would engage in threesomes for this reason. It didn't necessarily make them unhappy, or it wasn't a negative for them. But sometimes it was just this thing that they could do to make their partner happy. And So if it's not going to have a big impact on you and it will make someone else happy, why not? And this was sometimes the reasoning that was coming out. It wasn't necessarily a desire. It was more of a lack of meaningful resistance, or, well, yeah, why shouldn't I have a threesome? Why not?
Because one of the perceptions of threesomes, and again, this might just be a media creation, is it's kind of used for a married couple to spice up their sex life, which has become a bit a bit dull or a bit boring. Is there any truth in that?
I think there is some truth in that. I think when you look at people who start to engage in consensual non-monogamy, there are a number of studies which suggest some people do come to it after a number of years together. And it could be that the foundation which is created allows people to feel safe in exploring and going out there. But there are also people who go into it straight away, and that is how they create relationships with lots of people.
I was going to say, do you mind giving us another example of someone that you interviewed with perhaps quite a different experience to the first one you mentioned?
So I spoke to a man, and it was quite interesting that him and his partner, they were at university, and they were playing a drinking game of Never Have I Ever. So typically in this game, if you have done a thing that somebody says I've never done, you stand up and drink. And Never Have I Ever Had a Threesome came up. And this gave rise to a sort of discussion about threesomes, and this man talking about his partner, they said, oh yeah, we would be interested in a threesome. Now at that group, there was a bisexual woman who was also open to the idea of a threesome. And she approached this man's partner and suggested it. And so then they left the club, they went and had a threesome, and they had quite a good time. And interestingly, because I spoke with both members of the couple, the man said that it was fine, it was quite good, it was not necessarily what he expected, but he was glad to have had the experience. The woman, however, said, when I asked her, well, how did you enjoy it? She said, yeah, no, it was great, had a great time. And I asked, how do you think your partner felt about it? And she was like, well, he was having sex with two women. Of course he enjoyed it. It was great. So there was a slight disconnect here between two people and how they both perceived the situation. She thought that her male partner had had a great time because there were two women, whereas he hadn't had the time that he had perhaps expected he would, because they focused a lot of time on each other. So they did end up actually having a discussion about this and went back, and they had a bit more of an equitable threesome with more people interacting with each other, and it was all a bit more balanced. And after that threesome, he was like, yep, the second one, it was so much better. It was, yeah, I didn't feel excluded. It was great. Whereas she actually felt, it wasn't as good that time. I wasn't the center of attention. So yeah, I think I preferred the first time. So we can see in this sort of small tale of threesomes that people will be wanting different things. People might assume the ethical thing is for everyone to share out the attention and it to be equally divvied up. But if that is not what you are looking for, not what you are wanting, then this can lead to a worse experience for yourself.
It's interesting what you said about their first experience there, because there is this perception that this is every heterosexual man's fantasy, isn't it? Two women or two lesbians. Anecdotally, having talked to a lot of my friends, that's not necessarily true. But we often play this game. Men love to watch lesbian sex. Men want a threesome with two women. Almost like there's this necessity to say it, even if it's not reality. And actually, you know, as I said, speaking to a lot of my friends, I don't watch lesbian porn. They're not particularly interested in it anyway. Yeah.
It's this constructed idea, this constructed image. And yeah, is what men feel that they should be saying. It will give them, in the eyes of other men, perhaps more masculine capital than having a threesome with another man. But as saying before, it depends on the men. It depends on how people treated each other. And
It's also interesting what you said about the logistics of it. There must be a pressure to how do you divvy up your time, for example? Are you supposed to spend an equal amount of time on each person? And if it's your partner, are you supposed to show them more love and affection to the third person? All gets a bit confusing, Ryan.
Absolutely. No, it really does. And you would find if people entered into threesomes as a single person, typically they would, if they were not joining a couple, conversations about things were more minimal. If they were part of a couple or joining a couple, there was more chance that there would be discussions. And typically it seemed as though having discussions would be a good way for people to avoid these kind of miscommunications and these mismatches in expectations. So perhaps talking about beforehand what you are interested in doing, what you're not, and then checking in afterwards. These could stop these difficulties arising and people feeling excluded. But by the same token, some people want this spontaneity. They have this idea of a threesome is this spontaneous thing, and talking behind legs off of it is going to make it really formulaic and uninteresting. And so they are more happy and they want to enter into it with that elevated level of risk because it's more exciting. They don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I did wonder if it was over planned and discussions, it could be both desexualizing, but also a huge amount of pressure as well.
Yeah, and certainly people did talk about the psychological burden of being aware that their partner had particular fears or anxieties, and trying to keep that in mind, whilst you're also trying to keep in mind navigating a sexual situation with two other people. And so it could almost take them out of that situation, which is, I think, for some people going to be less desirable. But this is what they felt they had to do in order to protect their relationship from the potential difficulties and jealousies and things that could harm it.
Thank you, Ryan. Have you now concluded all your research?
I am continuing with research. I'm broadening out and starting to look at consensual non-monogamy more generally, but I think there is more threesome research to be done. I've only started really uncovering the edge of what is happening. And so I do hope to be able to do more research into this area in the future, as well as more areas of consensual non-monogamy and masculinities and a lot of things. There's just not enough time for everything.
Yes, yeah. But the work that you've just done, is your book being released soon? When
my book has been released. Yeah, that is published. Yeah, that is available on Amazon, and it is, unfortunately, as many academic books are, quite pricey, but by the end of the year, I believe it should be out in paperback, so it is going to be a bit less eye-wateringly priced. So yeah, it will be available. But if you go to my website, I do have the PDF of the first chapter up there if you wanted to understand a little bit more. And there's also a number of my articles about threesomes on there, which you can read all for free.
Right. And I think there was a code for a discount of some sort as well.
There is, a code for a 20% discount if you go directly to the publisher. Whether they are the cheapest, I cannot say.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. And do you mind just telling the listeners where they can find out more about your work? You mentioned you've got a website. I know you're on Twitter as well.
Yep. So if you go to my website, ryanscoatesphd.com, or I am on Twitter, that's @rscoats. Or if you just Google threesome research or Ryan Scoats, you will find lots about me on the internet and a number of the other interviews and podcasts I've done. So if you are interested in this area, I have put out and contributed to a lot of content. So there's plenty for you to read.
You're still looking for interviewees? There might be some listeners out there who want to get involved in your research.
Oh, always happy to have people get in contact. And yeah, the next study is always on the horizon. So it's good to have these connects.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Ryan. I really, really appreciate it. And a fascinating piece of research.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.